This is the Roots and All podcast, here to help you get growing. Join us as we explore everything plant-related, both indoors and out, and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Presented by Sarah Wilson.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Roots and All podcast. Today I'm speaking to Jackie Currie, who's the holder of the National Collection of Alliums. As well as being an allium aficionado, Jackie makes up one half of Euphorbia Design with her partner Lorraine. They provide a garden design service that specialises in plant knowledge, and they work in the Surrey area of the UK. And as always, I'll put links to Jackie's work in the show notes. Now, I'm not saying that alliums are tricky, but if you thought you could go through a nice catalogue, pick an allium you like the look of, put it in the ground, and then it would come back year after year, Jackie's here to disabuse you of that notion. So, Jackie, thank you for joining me on the podcast. My first question is, could you give us a brief introduction as to what alliums are and what they look like?
The traditional allium is how I describe as a purple ball on a stick. But alliums range in size from 10 centimetres to 2 metres in height. They're a very varied group of plants. They think they are a very old genus because they're way across the northern hemisphere. So you could have a tiny weeny little plant in China and then a massive allium growing in North America. They all have, we'd say, tepals, but they have 6 petals. And the other way of looking at them is, smelling them. If they smell of onion, you know it's an allium.
And when you say tepals, are they those little things that you get at the base of the kind of head of the flowers that go a bit... No,
tepals are what you'd say is the petals.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the other day I looked up what tepal meant because everyone says tepals and I just followed the same as everyone else. And tepal is the generic term when you don't know the difference between a petal and a sepal.
So what colours might we expect them to come in and what
the
kind of
traditional
height?
colour is purple,
Mm-hmm.
but they range in colours. They come in white, pink, purple, lilac and yellow. There are some that they'd say are a sort of limey green, but there's no orange ones. Oh, and there are pink.
Do you know of any more unusual colours that are in the breeding stage at the moment? Do you think we're likely to see colours varying in the future?
Not into the orange, no.
Mm-hmm.
There has been a lot of breeding work done, particularly with the one that's sort of a very dark wine red, which is Allium atropurpureum, which they mix with a lot of the others. So there's one called Silver Spring, which is white with a purple ovary, but it's not very hardy.
Right.
I wouldn't recommend it.
And what is the main flowering period for alliums?
The traditional flowering period is end of April, May, and into early June. But alliums, you can have an allium flowering from March all the way through to October.
So depending on the varieties that you choose, you could potentially...
Yes, you can succession flower all the way from March to October.
When should I be thinking about ordering my allium bulbs?
Now. September's the time to order them.
Mm-hmm.
And the best time to plant them for the majority of them is October. There's some that I would recommend you plant right now, which are the ones that are called Ampliprasum, which looks and is the parent of the leek. But the rest, October. But you can plant all the way to Christmas. I've done trials on Allium Purple Sensation. So I planted 10 in September, 10 in October, 10 November, 10 December. And then I tried 10 after Christmas. All the ones up to Christmas were perfectly okay. The one in January was a bit weak, did flower, but it was a very small and weedy flower.
How early could you order them if you were raring to go?
Usually if you order them in August, they'll come mid-September.
And then don't plant them out as soon as you get them? Wait until October?
Yes, you can do.
Good.
It won't do them any harm.
Okay. And the other thing that I find sometimes if I don't get round to planting my bulbs, sometimes they can go a little bit squidgy or they can develop a little bit of mould on them. How can you combat that?
You need to keep them cool and dry and don't have them in a plastic bag. They need to be in a bag with lots of holes. There's these sort of net bags or in a paper bag. That will help, but alliums are prone to viruses, so you're best to get them and plant them as soon as you can. But also check your bulbs when you buy them from a nursery. And if they look like they are diseased, you must send them back.
In terms of growing conditions, do they all suit the same type of soil? I think I know the answer to this question because I had some in my garden that disappeared last year. So I suspect they weren't happy.
That's the myth. So there is an allium for most growing conditions. So there's some that like clay and some that particularly like sand. And there's one that I grow, Allium willickii, which will even likes bog conditions. It will grow in normal garden soil, but thrives in a bog condition. But the main reason your alliums don't work is how you treat them during the summer. So most people say, I bought these alliums, I planted them in the first year they came up, they were stunning. And then the second year they disappeared. And that is because a lot of alliums need a dry summer rest. So what I do, I've split my alliums into 3 groups for gardeners. So there's the first group, which is the easy peasy ones, which you put them in the ground, you leave them, and they just do their thing every year. So it includes chives, but there are ones like Allium multissimum, Christophii, Spirocephalum. You put them in and you can just leave them. What you do need to do, though, is every 3 years is lift them and divide them, purely because the bulbs get so congested that the flower will get smaller and smaller because it just hasn't got the room to grow. Then you've got the second group, which is the group where year 1, it comes up, it flowers, and then that bulb then splits into 4, 5, maybe 6 smaller bulbs, so very similar to a garlic clove. And those need to be lifted, split up, replanted individually, but the following year they'll come up as leaves, won't flower, and then the year after the bulb will be big enough and you can have flowers on it the next year. So they flower alternate years. So what I'd say with those is the year they don't flower, plant ones that will flower, and then you'll have succession flowers year after year. And then the group, which in some ways is the most important group, which is the group that is what's causing all the confusion. They're the alliums that once they finish flowering, and as soon as they finish flowering, you need to lift them, dry them, and I call it baking, but what you need to do is you dry them off, clean off all the soil, and you put them in the greenhouse to heat up. The Dutch do it between 23 and 26 degrees. And this is what has caused all the problems. The Dutch growers, every year, they lift all their bulbs, they dry them, they bake them in the greenhouse for the summer, and then a percentage go off to be sold, and the other, a lot, are then put back in the ground for the following year as their stock plants. So it's knowing which ones you need to lift and bake and the ones that you can leave in the ground.
$1 million question is, how do you know?
So I've had to do that through trial and error. What I initially did is I worked out why my alliums are failing and what I needed to do. And I thought, it can't be that. It really can't be that. And I thought, well, the only thing I can do is to go over to Holland and speak to them. So I went over to Holland, spoke to the growers who thought I was slightly mad and said, yes, well, we just lift all our bulbs, dry them, bake them, regardless of which type it is, other than the ones that need to be kept moist at all times. So you wouldn't do that to a chive, you wouldn't do it to senescens or lusitanica, or the sort of clump-forming group. And so I tried to find someone to help me who must have already done the research. Someone must have done it. And no one had. So I had to literally trial and error. So what I'd do is I would pick 10 of one type. So I'd do a row of 10. Year 1, wait for them to all come up. At the end of year 1, once I knew they've all flowered once, I'd lift 5, dry them and bake them so I know that I'd keep, I still had some stock plants. And the other 5 I'd leave in for a following year to see what would happen. And it was purely working out which ones came back up and which ones didn't, that I knew which I needed to dry and bake and which ones I could leave in. From then on, I could then start to work out, by looking at it and knowing the parentage, which ones would die and which ones would keep going. So if you've got anything that's mixed with Allium giganteum, you have to lift and bake it. So if you've got a tepal that's rounded, it's a giganteum and you'll need to lift and bake. If it has a very long, thin tepal like a Christophii, then you'll know that it's tough and it will come back every year. The exception to the rule is Allium ambassador, which you can leave in, but it has rounded tepals. And one of the parents is Gigantium, but there's something else in it that's stronger than the Gigantium that keeps it going.
And what are some common varieties that we might come across in a catalogue that are the type that you need to lift and bake?
There's one that I'd say don't even bother lifting and bake it. You won't be able to keep it going, but it's beautiful, is Allium atropurpureum, which is that lovely shuttlecock shape and wine red. It's stunning, but I say to people, if you're going to grow it as an annual. Even the Dutch struggle to keep it going. They lose 20%, but they use it to breed with other plants because it's so beautiful. So you do see it a lot within other alliums. The other one that, again, you have to lift and bake is Allium schubertii, which is that amazing exploding firework. Absolutely stunning, but you must lift it and bake it as soon as it's finished flowering or you'll lose it. And that's also an odd one. Alliums reproduce in a couple of ways. So they either reproduce through seed or they're reproduced by the bulb splitting into 1, 2, 3, however many, depending on the type. Schubertii never, ever, ever splits. The bulb just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it drops dead. And that's just how it grows. So don't be surprised, even if you manage to keep it going 4 or 5 years, you might find at the end of 5 years that it will die anyway. And it also hates being grown in a pot, Schubertii. It's particularly troublesome. Going back to Allium atropurpureum, the reason that it is tricky to keep is its summer rest needs to be at a very high temperature because it comes from Iran, Iraq area where it gets incredibly hot and dry in the summer. And we can't really even replicate those conditions in your own greenhouse.
I think probably one that's very eye-catching in the catalogues is the Currie. Is that lift and bake?
Yes.
So all the pretty ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Currie cesium, that's another one that needs to be lifted and baked. Very good one that you don't need to lift and bake. It's a lovely one. You don't see it very often, but it's a really good doer. Is Allium eros.
Okay.
Unifolium is the parent, which is quite weak in comparison. Eros is a beautiful, short, pink shuttlecock-shaped allium that I say is for someone who doesn't like alliums. If you don't like the purple ball on a stick, go for Allium eros. The bulb is a bit odd because it looks like a little white amoeba. Doesn't look like a traditional bulb. And normally you say when you plant a bulb, you plant it pointy side up. Well, the pointy bit on Allium eros is the basal plate where the roots come from. So you put pointy side down and the side that the leaves come up is completely flat. And the first time I got some, I looked and thought, I don't know how to plant it. I don't know. I can't tell one end from the other. But you'll soon see. It's a very good front of the border allium, comes from North America. Plant them in groups of a minimum of 5. End of the first year, what will happen, this little amoeba splits into 2. And those bulbs, then you've got 2 new flowering alliums. So that after a couple of years, you've got quite a nice clump.
So what happened with mine, which again I think is what some alliums do, is mine, because I'm lazy, I just left all the seed heads around my border. And then one day I went past and, by the way, the allium in question was, I think, Mount Everest. And it seeded around. And I had, where I'd left the seed heads, I had huge, great clumps of these seedlings. And I thought, brilliant, I can thin those out or they'll just do the job themselves and I'll have more come back next year. And then they just disappeared. So I don't know what happened again.
Mount Everest is the one I recommend. It's a good white.
Oh, it was a beautiful allium. It just disappeared. It just never came back.
I wonder if you may have thought you'd bought Mount Everest and you'd been actually given Mont Blanc. Mont Blanc is notorious for not lasting very long. You wouldn't have to lift and bake it. Mount Everest, I've never had a problem with. I leave mine in and they come back every year.
We won't go into details to where I bought them from, but from what you were saying, it could be that sometimes you'll get bulbs that are mislabeled and not what you think they are, and that's not just alliums. That is across the board with bulbs sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's interesting. But some alliums do seed around if they're happy, don't they?
Yes,
and
they
you can
do.
end up with quite a few.
Yes.
Are there any that are particularly prone to doing that?
Majority of them will do that. I don't have a problem with it. My purple sensation is one that I'd say you do lose the odd bulb, but if you leave them to seed, the seedling ones you never seem to lose. And I know it takes 5 years from seed to a flowering bulb, but it's worth it because, I mean, what's the worst you can do? Just dig them up and move them or throw them away. But the self-seeded purple sensations are better than the purple sensation you plant to start with. If you don't want an allium to seed anywhere, then go for Globemaster, which is an excellent allium. It's been around a long time now. It's one you can leave in the ground. You do need to lift it every 3 to 5 years because it will get congested. And that one, the head really does get a lot smaller if you don't separate the bulbs, but it's sterile, so it doesn't seed around.
That's what I was sort of alluding to, I suppose, was some bulbs get weaker year on year, but with the alliums, that's not really the case because they're either doing what Schubertii does, which is flowering to death, or they need dividing. So a bit like daffodils, I guess. Do they ever come up blind if they get congested?
I've never left them that long. They usually, if they're coming up blind, it usually means they've got a virus.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you need to feed them?
When I plant them, I usually give them a little bit of fish and bone in the hole before I plant it. Mm-hmm. Other than that, no, I don't feed them much at all.
And can you grow them in pots? I know you said some aren't suited, but are there any that do?
Some of the smaller, more specialist ones I grow in pots, partially so I don't lose them in the soil, partially because it means that as soon as they finish flowering or as they are flowering, I can dry them off by putting them straight in the greenhouse and they can finish their flowering in the greenhouse and they won't get any more moisture on them, any rain, so I can keep them going. But the majority of them do prefer being in the ground.
And in terms of sunshine or shade?
Most of them prefer full sun. A lot will cope with semi-shade. So Allium nigerum is a very good one that can be left in the ground and is happy in semi-shade and even quite a lot of moisture. Purple Sensation doesn't mind semi-shade. Ambassador doesn't mind semi-shade. Gladiator. A lot of them will cope with semi-shade as long as they get some sun during the day.
And if you were talking about a particularly difficult spot, say, that was dry and relatively shady, is there anything that might cope with that? Or is that asking too much?
There is one that flowers in March, although it might be dry shade. You've had the moisture from the winter, called Allium paradoxum variety normale. Don't ever buy paradoxum. It is pernicious weed, but it will seed everywhere and has hardly any flowers on it. Mm-hmm. But this particular one is well behaved. Comes up, it's only about 20 to 30 centimetres high with a little white flower, and that will cope with the dryness. So if you're growing under, say, deciduous shrubs, it will have done its thing, and then by the time it's finished flowering, the shrubs have got their leaves and it's died down, and it will just sit there under the soil ready for the following year.
In terms of flowers, how long do the flowers last? Does that vary from type to type?
It varies more with the weather. So if it's particularly wet or particularly hot and dry, they don't last quite as long, but usually 4 to 6 weeks.
And they make good cut flowers too, don't they?
Yes, some are better than others. Also, don't forget some of them that are very, very oniony, smelly.
Very true. The other thing that I think a lot of people find with the alliums is that the flowers and the flower stalks look lovely and the leaves look tatty. Can you take those leaves off?
Yes, I quite often trim them down. Or the other way, if you haven't got the time, because I've got a lot, if you plant round them with things like geraniums, other perennial plants, then you don't see them. That's the best thing to do.
And they don't mind pushing their way up through a small canopy of other perennial plants?
No, they don't mind at all. With the bigger ones, some of the smaller ones, the late summer flowers don't like having sort of like a geranium flopping on top of them. But the sort of Purple Sensations or Mount Everest, no, they don't mind.
And when they finish flowering, should I cut the spent seed flower heads back?
if you leave them on, then you may have lots of seedlings, which if you're a very neat and tidy gardener and don't like seeing all the seedlings, then cut them off. If you like to see sort of autumn with the seed heads on, then leave them on. You may find if it's very windy, something like Christophia, the head does blow off and then it looks like you've got tumbleweed running all around the garden.
Do pollinators like them, or does the oniony smell put those off too?
Bees love alliums. I always say to people, if they're coming up to my allotment to see my collection when they're all flowering, one of the things I say is, are you frightened of bees? Because if you are, then you can't come up there, because you'll find the bees will be hitting you, literally bouncing off your body to try and get to the alliums, because they're just bonkers about them. And Allium siculum, what used to be called Nectroscordon, bumblebees are bonkers for them. And when we were in Holland, I was standing in the sort of firing line of Allium siculum, and the bumblebees were literally bombarding me, sort of trying to push me out the way to get to these flowers. Some of them hoverflies like. So there's one, the cesium and the Litvinovii, which are quite tricky to grow. But again, when we were out in Holland, because they had grown them in such large quantities, you could see that the only thing that went to these were the hoverflies. And then you've got the summer flowers, such as senescens, lusitanica, angulosum. They're all loved by bees and by butterflies.
So they would be a good one to plant if you had a wildlife garden.
Yes.
So we've mentioned that they come up well through other perennials. Is there anything else that they kind of work well with, or are there any perennials that you think they look particularly lovely next to?
I think they go with anything.
Yeah.
But I'm biased. I think they go in most schemes. I've seen them in some very modern schemes, and then also in traditional cottage garden.
Yeah, I agree. They're one of those plants that works well in both. Yeah, they're very versatile. Do they suffer from any pests or diseases?
Yes, some slugs and snails will munch some of the leaves. They're not too much of a problem, but you have got the allium aphid, which can be devastating if you get enough of them. There's also I think it's called the allium leaf miner, which causes a problem with onions, leeks, garlic, and then also the alliums. But you don't see it that often. And some of them are also prone to rust. I had rust this year, or I think it was to do with the heat. They got very stressed. Allium fistulosum, which is mainly grown as an edible, but I do grow it as an ornamental as well.
And I'm always trying to find natural solutions to any pests and diseases. Is there anything that you can recommend that might work if you did have an outbreak of, say, the rust or aphids?
I'm trying oregano, planting oregano with it. It's had some success. This summer was particularly difficult because of the heat. I have read that it's supposed to help, but other than that, no, I haven't found anything that can help.
So companion planting, kind of theoretically, yeah. Fantastic. Well, I'll be interested to find out how you get on with that. And my last question is, what is your favourite and why? I know it's probably a really impossible question to answer, but...
Do I have to pick one?
No, you can have more than one. Two.
Could I have three?
Yeah, go on then. One from each group.
So Allium Early Emperor, which is an early one, and it comes from Iran, but from an area of Iran which the soil conditions and the weather is very similar to here. So it's the first of the big flashy ones to flower. So it's April and it's stunning. 2 or 3 years, it's bulked up, it's gorgeous. And if you look at it closely, it's bicoloured. So it's the tepals are purple and the anther it looks white from the distance, so actually pale pink. So I love that one. Allium Christophii, it's a real toughie, very big, lousy, gorgeous, and quite quirky. I have found that it moves around in the soil, the actual bulb itself. So I started out, when I first had my collection, I had them in rows, and I used a line to plant my row of 10. And I try and do straight lines. And I came back and I looked at these alliums, and they'd moved themselves all over the place. And I thought, well, that's not possible. And then later in the season, I found it moves itself up and down as well. So it pushes itself out of the soil. And I thought, well, that can't be right. I went to a couple of gardens that we'd planted up, some Christophii, and I found them sitting on the surface. And I thought, have I had a moment and I've forgotten to plant these ones? So I replanted them, and then went back a couple of weeks later and they pushed themselves back up. And they seem to come up at certain times and then drop down. And I think it's maybe for the heat. So they come up, get a bit of heat, and then when they've had enough, they literally drop down 10 centimetres in the soil. Because then I thought, what's happened? The squirrel ran off with it, dug down, and there it was. It literally dropped itself down. So I like that one because it's pretty, but it's also got some personality.
That's a really good point. If you do see your allium bulbs uncovered, then don't be tempted to replant them.
I wouldn't
or just
bother
leave
because
them
it'll push
doing
itself
their
back
thing.
up.
That's amazing.
And then, of course, Allium eros. It's different and it is beautiful. Definitely worth growing.
Thank you, Jackie, for your insight into alliums. I think a lot of people will be surprised to find out just how tricky they are. If you don't want to get caught out planting alliums that don't last or need a lot of work, I'll put a list of those Jackie recommended in the show notes, but it might be worth keeping an eye on her work in the future, just saying. So thank you for listening, and I will catch you next Tuesday.
For more information, visit the Roots and All website at rootsandall.co.uk. To download more episodes, visit iTunes, your favourite podcast provider, or get them direct from our website.